Okay, so this is part 3 of 3 on our lecture regarding the Elizabeth Loftus article on eyewitness testimony. So, now we're going to talk about the fourth and final experiment that's captured by this article. In this case, 150 students from the University of Washington, run in groups of various sizes, same protocol as all the previous 3 studies, viewed a 3-minute film clip taken from the inside of an automobile, which eventually collides with a baby carriage being pushed by a man. So as you can imagine, a very emotionally charged, but very fast-moving and complex visual experience. So following the presentation of the film, each subject received one of 3 types of booklets corresponding to the experimental conditions. So now, still a single factor experiment, so one independent variable, but now we have 3 levels to the independent variable. 100 subjects received booklets containing 5 key and 40 filler questions. So we now have a control group, a direct version, and a false presupposition version, and we'll go through each of those in a little detail. Again, 40 filler questions, so questions that are not really relevant to the experimental condition, but are meant to distract from the 5 key questions that we're interested in. So at this point, the fourth study, it's become a little more complicated in terms of the number of things we're looking at. In the direct version, the key questions are asked in a fairly direct manner about items that were not present in the film. So one example is, did you see a school bus in the film? These are all things that were not present. And in the false presupposition version, the key questions contain false presuppositions referring to an item that did not occur in the film, but the corresponding example was, did you see the children getting on the school bus? So as you see, there's a slight derivation between the questions that were brought up by experiment 3, which was, is it simply suggestion? So the direct version is simply suggestion. Did you see a school bus in the film? In the second, we have that false presupposition of children getting on a school bus. And in the third, filler questions with no direct questions about what they saw as far as the key experimental condition is concerned. So the goal of using so many filler items was to minimize the possibility that the subjects would notice the false presuppositions. Again, all subjects returned 1 week later, and without reviewing the film clip, they answered 20 new questions about the incident, and 5 of these questions were critical, and therefore 15 were also distraction or filler questions. They were direct questions, which are shown in Table 1 of the article. So hopefully you have the article, either the PDF or your printed out version in front of you. I had difficulty getting a good high-res version of this that you could view in a slide, so I'm going to reference this, but I want you to look at Table 1 along with me here. And these are the 5 key questions, okay? So if you're looking at the table, which, obviously it looks like this, it's printed in, well, let me have a hard time there. It's printed landscape instead of portrait. It's the only thing in the whole article that's printed this way. And what you have is the direct question. So examples of this include, did you see the school bus in the film? It has a corresponding false presupposition question. In that condition, you hear something like, did you see the children getting on the school bus? Some other examples. Direct question, did you see a center line on the country road? False presupposition version, did another car cross the center line on the country road? So essentially, these false presupposition questions, as opposed to the direct questions, provide a little context, right? They're more suggestive than direct in what they're asking. In the third column of this table, you see the percentage of yes responses to the direct question 1 week later. And it's broken down by conditions C, D, and F. Okay, so C represents control. These are people who in their initial packet had no false presupposition questions. D is those that had the direct false presupposition, the direct questions of something that did not exist in the film. And the third is F, which is the ones that have these false presupposition questions in their initial packet. And if you look at these questions, with essentially one exception, you can see that the percentage of yes answers goes up from control to direct to false presupposition. Okay. And again, the person's just answering yes or no with these questions. So you see, for example, on the first question, did you see a school bus in the film, or did you see the children getting on the school bus? 6 people in the control condition said yes. Now, of course, remember, there was no school bus in the film. 12 in the direct group that received the direct false statement in the initial question packet said they saw a school bus, and 26 of the 50 in the group, excuse me, there were 50 in each group, 150 total subjects, said they did see the school bus a week later. Next to that, you have the actual chi-square statistic for each of these questions, which is not really important for our purposes, but what is important is the p-value, which is the final column on the right. And as you can see, all of these p-values are 0.05 or less. So each of these is considered significant. This is a very robust effect for a study like this. You know, you'd be really pleased to get results where you saw a consistent and reliable, robust effect across all 5 questions. Okay. So what do these results mean? I know this is a very busy slide, but I'm trying to cover, everything included in this last experiment. Um, Overall, though, these are just averages across the 5 questions. Overall, those that have been exposed to questions including false presuppositions, 29.2 said yes to these key non-existent items. Those that have been exposed to direct questions, the average is 15.6. You can see these means at the bottom of the table as well, by the way. 8.4% in the control group said yes. So again, a very consistent progressive effect. The basic interpretation of this is that for those in the control condition, you see the lowest number of yes answers to things that were not present in the video. For the direct question, you see an increase, and then you see an even more substantial increase for those that have the false presupposition questions with the context included. So for each of these questions individually, the type of prior experiences significantly influence the percentage of the yes response. All chi-square values less than 0.05. And just as a reminder, that means there's a 5% chance or less that these types of findings were due entirely to chance. They did some additional chi-square tests to test the significance of differences between pairs of groups. So for example, the control versus the direct versus the false presupposition. They were all significant between the control group and the groups that were exposed to the false presuppositions. So if we collapse these 3 groups into 2, if we take the control group as one separate group, and then we collapse the direct and the false presupposition groups into one group, those that received some form of a false presupposition in their initial packet, they also are significant from one another. So overall, there was a highly significant chi-square. The difference between the groups was significant between the direct groups and the false presuppositions. The difference between the control group and the group experiencing direct questions did not reach full significance. So what does that mean? Well, essentially what she found was that the most powerful form of suggestion to have a person report something that was not present in their original visual experience was those embedded sort of false presupposition questions that include a little bit of context, right? They're not simply direct. So she basically is looking at these 2 hypotheses of how memory works that were presented a little earlier in this lecture. The strengthening of the memorial representation versus the construction hypothesis. And she found you could use either of these hypotheses to account for the results in the first experiment, in which the presupposition of a true event increased the later assertion that the event had occurred. This is where they ask you about the stop sign, which was present, right? So we increase the strength of that relationship. You could just use a strength argument for that. You could also see the construction argument being presented accurately. But only the construction hypothesis explains the comparable results when the presupposition is false, as it is in experiments 2 through 4. So she therefore considers the form of a theory of she wants to form a theory of memory for complex visual experiences in which this constructive mechanism plays an integral role. And figure 1, as opposed to table 1, figure 1 presents a skeleton of this theory that has 3 major components. The first 2 components involve how we acquire memory, and then the third involves our retrieval process. So let's look at that figure. This is directly from the article. As you can see, there's a split between the acquisition processes and the retrieval processes. So in the acquisition, we have this basic idea of deciding what to look at, right? These are fast, complex visual experiences. Everything's happening very quickly. You're not necessarily paying attention to a stop sign or whether or not there's a center line or a bus, for example, or a barn in the case of one of the middle experiments there. You're making a decision what to look at, and you're integrating that information into some visual representation of the experience in your mind. Now, you are then acquiring some subsequent information potentially through those initial questions. And in the case of these studies, these are questions that involve either true or false presuppositions. Then we go into the retrieval process of memory, which is the representation of that altered representation. So this thing's been altered by these presupposition questions, and then you produce a response. Now, this may seem overly simplistic, but for the time in 1975, this was somewhat new, somewhat novel way of looking at information retrieval, information processing in terms of memory. So let's move on to the next slide here. Okay, so I'm going to go into this in some detail here. Now, just for the purposes of the exam, I don't expect you to be able to answer an essay question, for example, or to speak in great detail about all of the aspects of Loftus's theory of memory. But I want you to have a good understanding of what this article is saying, because I think it's a great example of a well-designed experiment. So she talks about first the acquisition of the original experience. So there's a complex event, and we extract certain pieces of information, we make decisions, and we store that information. So you decide which aspects of that visual stimulus you're going to attend to. And there's a lot of information in a typical visual environment. And the proportion of that information that you actually perceive is very small. And so we make a process, we decide what we're going to attend to, and this corresponds to where our next eye fixation is likely to be. And then we begin to form a representation. And what form does that newly acquired information take? So a prominent view is that when a person experiences an event, we organize and retain knowledge about that event in forms of statements or propositions that can be treated as a labeled graph structure. And there's some examples in the book she talks about. Other hypotheses are that there's decision routines, like decision trees that we make along the process. Others are that we have mental images that are sort of related but not perfect proportional to the original event. And one resolution, though, is that people may use more than one form of representation that can be sufficiently flexible to store this information, depending on what's most appropriate. For example, if you're on the street watching the event as opposed to being in the car, you're going to have different priorities in what you're attending to and what you're storing in terms of the information. And we can sort of transform from one form of information to another. Then we acquire subsequent information. Okay, so there's little reason to believe that that representation we form in our memory is entirely accurate. And in fact, we can see from Loftus's research and lots of subsequent research that it's quite malleable, it's quite changeable, and can be affected and influenced by other events than those it's supposed to represent. So events or information that occur subsequently, and probably in some cases prior to, can alter the representation of the event. And so one way this might be accomplished is by simply influencing the process by entering new information into the existing memory structure, so enhancing, enriching, or in some cases, altering that structure. So for example, those initial questions that have false presuppositions. And she refers to this added information as external to distinguish it from the information that was acquired during the actual initial experience. So then we have to retrieve it. And so sometime after we've had the initial visual experience, we've had this sort of first interrogation or questioning process, we can be quizzed again, questioned by the police, asked to testify in court. And at that point, she's arguing that through this construction model, this construction theory of memory, we're recreating that long-term memory, at least the portion of it that we need to answer the question. So the information is based both on the information we acquired during the original experience and the external information we acquired subsequently, usually right after. This regenerated image has some internal structure, which may or may not be visual. Some of it may be verbal. Some of it may be auditory. Some of it may be, olfactory. We have 5 senses we're operating under. In fact, we have more than 5 senses when you look at the research on perception. But it must contain information that's spatial in reference to the structure of what happened. So any response we make is based on this regenerated image. And to reiterate, this information is acquired during a very complex experience, and it integrates into this overall representation of the memory. Subsequent information about that event, such as that introduced inadvertently via questions containing true or false presuppositions, is also integrated, and it can alter that initial representation. And when you're later queried about the original experience, you form a new image based on the altered representation, and you base your response on that image. Okay? So this is the general overview of what's going on here in this article. This is part 3. So I want you to think back to the entire article, and I want to emphasize just a few things very quickly to summarize. First and foremost, as I said, it's a good example of an experimental study. So I want you to think back to the things we've discussed in the previous chapters, especially the last chapter, about an experiment. What does it contain? It contains random assignment. Now, she doesn't go into it in great detail, but it's sort of understood that these subjects, these University of Washington students that are brought in, they're randomly assigned to one or more conditions of the independent variable. I'm sorry, not one or more. In some cases, there's only 2 levels, and in some cases, there's 3 in the last study. But you're randomly assigned to one of those 2 or 3 groups. Okay, so there is random assignment. That's one of the key factors that defines an experiment. There is an independent variable in each case. Whether or not you have a question that involves a presupposition or not, whether or not you have a question that involves a false presupposition. In the 4th experiment, whether or not you have a direct question that has a false statement in it, or whether you have that false presupposition context question, or if you're in the control group. So again, independent variable that's manipulated with multiple levels, at least more than one. And then finally, we have the dependent variable, which is a lot of these yes/no questions about what you observe. Those are our dependent variables. She utilizes inferential statistics. She gives you descriptive statistics as well. So all of the pieces of the puzzle are here to basically define an experimental design. For the purposes of the exam, I want you to understand the basics of what the structure of these 4 experiments are, but I'm not expecting you to remember every detail as far as the numerical outcomes of them, but you should understand the progression of the experiments from 1 through 4 and kind of what she's building upon, and have a very general sense of what her construction theory of memory is. Again, not in extensive detail, but there's a reason why this study is considered groundbreaking. In fact, there's multiple reasons why it's considered groundbreaking. I think one is that it broke into the general body of knowledge outside of science and psychology. This study was widely disseminated, and it became part of a general discussion we saw in sort of secondary sources in magazines and in books and in movies about eyewitness testimony and how it could be influenced. It certainly had a massive impact on the justice system, both criminal and civil, and there's a reason why Elizabeth Loftus is an incredibly sought-after expert witness to testify at various different trials, because she essentially could be brought in by the defense to argue that eyewitness testimony is not, written in stone and always perfect. And she can argue through the utilization of science why that is. She can also sometimes look for examples of people that have been influenced by, law enforcement or lawyers that are not necessarily operating with the best intentions. The interrogation process can, with people, especially people that are vulnerable in various ways, can influence their recollection of events and in fact sometimes introduce false information. So we do know that, there are examples of false confessions and sort of misrepresentations of events based upon initial interrogation or questioning by law enforcement or lawyers or district attorneys, that kind of thing. So it's a massively influential study in that sense, but it's also important for our class because I think it, as I said before, it's a really great example of an experimental study, and it hits on all of the cylinders that we're looking for to understand what an experiment is and how you build up the evidence and how you address all 3 prongs of causation in order to make an argument of a cause and effect. There's a lot of temporal precedence in this study. You have the initial visual experience of the film, and then you have the initial questioning, and then you have the follow-up, in some cases moments, but in the 3 later studies a week later. So again, I want you to think about it in terms of what we've learned about experiments, and hopefully you've enjoyed this lecture and it's given you a little bit of understanding about first one singular groundbreaking study, but also how we go about designing a really well-designed multi-experiment journal article that follows that hourglass structure. It starts very general in a literature review about memory and theories of memory. It becomes very specific in detail about the studies itself, and then it branches out much, the widening of the hourglass at the end, where it talks about the entire process of information processing and memory. So I will be posting an assignment that I'd like you to complete. That's just a series of 4 questions related to the Elizabeth Loftus study. You might want to have it on hand, as I mentioned in the introduction, while you're listening to this or while you're reviewing the article or looking over the slides. Hope you are all doing well and being safe, and I will be talking to you very soon again through the Canvas page. Have a good day.